Tonight, we've got Darren Francis Casey himself, also known as the Turtle, joining us live from Bendigo. Darren, welcome to you.
Thanks, boys. It's a pleasure that you invited me. It's been a few years since I've reflected, I guess, on the past of my career or the career of many cyclists I've worked with. So it's always interesting, the tales from that. I mean, some people call it infamous, but for me, I just call it gladiators and, warriors of, of riders that I've worked with that were nobodies that become famous. So for me, it's always good to share the other side that people or the public don't know about a lot of these famous bike riders, and even the ones that were caught up in infamous doping affairs, that they're actually real people that were just honest athletes that were just caught in a cycle of whatever happened in that era. And look, I fully respect those athletes, all of them in that era, and yeah, I still embrace them, to be honest.
Awesome, mate. Awesome, mate. Awesome. We look forward to hearing those stories, and we'll say a quick g'day to Paul. How are you, Paul?
Good evening, Simon. Good evening, Darren. Mate, looking forward to your story. And I'm going to jump in really quickly and ask you, obviously, the story behind the bike in the background, mate. It's an obvious question. So can you tell us about the history?
Well, the main part of my career being an interior designer that turned to a bike rider that sort of I wasn't a winner, but I did ride, 5 Sun Tour Scratchman, and we'll come back to Marcel, Wust, who I rode many of my Sun Tours with. But my connection with this climb bike comes all the way back from Marcel to the famous Teutenberg family, Eno Yoko, who runs, of course, the Trek women's team, Lars Teutenberg, who does a lot of development over the years with, with Green Edge, and also with Specialized with Peter Sagan, and also Sven Teutenberg, who got me the job in the long run to work for Gerolsteiner. And this bike is David Reblin's bike from Klein that he rode the Milan San Marino in the early 2000s. I think it was about 14th. So
does he know you've got it? Does he know you've got it?
Yeah, he gave it to me as a present. So when I retired from Gerolsteiner, these bikes were all individually made. So Gerolsteiner, we had the nightmare. Every bike, so that top tube is 55 centimeters top tube by only 52 down tube. So in the Klein days with Gary Klein, so we had Trek with US Postal with Trek, and then we had Klein bikes. So all these bikes were individually made with this design I did for Gerolsteiner, which took 4 days to paint.
Wow.
So this bike, David just wasn't happy with the top tube, so he changed that geometry. So when I retired from Gerolsteiner, he actually gave me this bike as a present. So I've always kept, this bike. I mean, the paint job itself is just, Klein bikes in its time were just, they were a piece of art. I mean, they were years in front when it comes to, aerospace, space, technology with the carbon fork, integrated head stem, cables. They were we're talking about a bike that was 5 to 10 years in front of bikes that you see now, huh?
Stunning.
If it's a board.
Hey, so as a designer, would you recommend presenting a bike like that in a home without parts and without wheels, or would you recommend putting it together and setting it up, even if you didn't ride it?
Look, I should have it set up, and that's my detriment. But at the moment, I just like it as a piece of art how it is. So
it looks beautiful.
It's definitely, like a piece of art just sitting there. There's no question. So
awesome.
It just does itself justice. But it's just one of many, the special pieces from that era. Gerolsteiner, we can talk all night about, Reblin, Cole, the guys that went through Schumacher and that team. But like I said, it was an institution. A friend, mine with Heinrich Hausler and those type of guys. And the German teams always did things well. Like, they were meticulous in their material. So Hans Mikkel Holzer, my boss, who employed me, he started the Shimano service course. So he was the originator from that system, So, Gerolsteiner did all the testing, with predominantly with Fabian Wiegmann, the German champion. We did all the Di2 testing. So it's very famous when it comes to the Shimano family. But, back in those eras, it was just amazing. I mean, you look now, you've got disc brake and all the technologies, but back then, we were trailblazers, when the Di2 first, I remember riding my second Sun Tour, and I remember when I I think the Di2 first come to Australia, everyone laughed at it. Everyone was just like, "Oh, what's this for a joke?" Huh? Like, it was quite funny. I think it was with the Toshiba team, and they come out, and Francois Bernard was second in the Tour de France, and he rode the Sun Tour, and everyone just joked, and he said, "Well, the Di2 will never, will never be a thing." Isn't that quite funny? And you look at now the disc brake is going through the same debate. Disc brake will never be a part of the future. But I remember back when Di2 with Shimano, it was all a laughing stock of the group having these gears that's pre-electronic.
Hey mate, we've raced a bit forward into mechanicking and stuff, but take us back to that first time you rode a bike. Were you in Bendigo at the time?
Yeah, well, Bendigo is all about the famous part of Bendigo. It's all about the track. So the Bendigo track, the Bendigo Madison, Danny Clark's. So the Bendigo, growing as a kid, you'd have 10 to 14,000 people at the Bendigo track. So cycling in Bendigo, and Bendigo is like one of the hotbeds, grassroots of Australian cycling.
Yeah.
So when you think of Australian cycling, Bendigo, is a powerhouse when it comes to track racing, and that's when I learned. I remember my brother rode with Tony Hughes, who's a famous bike rider. He won the Australian Madison with Urs Fruehler, and I remember one night he just said, like, we're a very poor Catholic family, 9 of us. And my track bike, I think my first frame come from the tip, and he just threw me on a bike and I rode a track race and I won my first race. So
you won your first race.
Yeah, so it's a handicap, of course. But the thing is, Bendigo, you have to get your inspiration. Everything comes from track racing. So that's when you first get inspired, is by track racing. So in Bendigo, you have to learn your art, which is, it goes through the history of cycling. Of me even coming back to Europe with O'Grady's and McGee's when they were nobodies, and I was working for Gerolstein, and they're having to go. So track racing has a lot to do with the history of Australian cycling, even on the roader.
Yeah.
So for me, track racing, and then you progress with the road. And Bendigo was very famous. Like a Sun Tour in Bendigo, the first Sun Tour in '89, there was 25 Australian riders and 12 were from Bendigo.
Wow.
So we're a very famous, area. But I remember Frank McKay, he was a very famous person in Bendigo. He was the promoter of the Bendigo Madison for a long time. And my first road bike I loved was with Campagnolo. It was a champagne-coloured Bonotto.
Wow. But how long did it take you to go from starting off to riding in your first Herald Sun Tour?
Well, it was just funny because, again, from an 18-year-old, bit of a shit, bike rider at 18, but a really hard coach. I did, I'm not a natural talent. And then 19, I rode the Midlands Tour, finished in the second I think the last guy beat me, which was Neil Stevens. No one really knew there. Got selected in the Sun Tour, and I rode my first Sun Tour at 19.
Wow.
And that was with an American team. And then the next year, that's when the second year I rode with Marcel Wust. And he was a very famous, he wasn't famous back then. He rode for RMO. So he took the French direction. So, he was always coming up against Deutsche Telekom with Eric Zabel. So I rode with this unknown quantity, which was Marcel Wust and a Frenchman, Bavatia. So that's when I learned about the life of, you can drink lots of alcohol, get pissed at night, wake up the next day, stages. So for me, someone who had to do everything, even just to survive on the gutter action at the Sun Tour, and then you get someone like Marcel, who was just a total charmer on and off the bike. And he come to Australia, and he changed the Sun Tour. He became really a real character. And he was just incredible. And our family and we are to this day very close to Marcel.
Do you have any favourite memories of this Herald Sun Tour that you think, oh wow, I was there, it was a great memory?
Yeah, and it was just great because he just always gave you confidence. And that's where he won enough prize money to actually go to Europe. But he was just an incredible character, and I think he molded. He was one of many guys that created such a, it gave an opportunity not just for the Australians, but also for European riders that were nobodies in Europe. He come to Australia and he made himself famous. And of course, he went up the ladder to that, the point of Festina when he won that prologue in the climbers jersey. Then the next day he won the sprint stage in the climbers jersey. So he owes a lot of his history or a lot of his life to the Sun Tour because it gave him the opportunity to be a winner. And as you know, in Europe, and to this day with a lot of Australian pros, you're only a number, aren't you? Like that 1% athlete, like a Bogacar, is really hard to achieve. But races like Australia and the Sun Tour hold their place. And that's where it's a shame, like even next year it's not continuing, or, with COVID, those races are just so important, aren't they?
Yeah.
But Marcel, absolute character to say the least of. So
you did 5 Herald Sun Tours?
Yeah, and look, it was just, I was more of a domestic, and, it was always funny riding with Marcel and, not having the best bikes. And I think once, I broke my bike, I think it was a Shogun. Like when I was riding, to get a mass-produced bike was a real thing. And I think I was in Mount Gambier. He was in that picture you put on social media. He gave me his team bike. I think it was the real aero, expensive bike.
Wow.
So that was my bike for the Sun Tour, because I couldn't afford, coming from a poor Catholic family. I remember having this bike from Marcel thinking, what the heck, So, and that was with the Belgian team. I was just trying to think. They had actually 2 different jerseys if they raced in France or Belgium. So, but he did create a lot of character for the Australian cycling team.
Yeah,
But
Darren,
back to, bikes like this, as working as a mechanic, with, because I originally started with Olympic. So what happened was I went for a holiday with Marcel. Being poor, I needed to work as the whole, So his father, Carl Wust, gave me a job as a mechanic at Touring and Ron Fast. And that was with Dieter Kostler's team in Cologne, which Jason Phillips, who is one of the main guys with SRAM Australia, SRAM Europe. So I rode with, I did a mechanics job with that team. So I did that, and I was sitting on a bench one day, and I was sitting next to a young guy, and his name was Jan Urik. And Carl said to me, that's going to be the next world champion.
Wow.
And he was so green, he blew the race apart, but blew himself apart. And of course, that year he won the world championships, and the next year he came out to the Commonwealth Bank Classic. So, but from then I met a famous guy called Gregor Braun, who's been podiumed in Flanders, Roubaix, and all those races. He was, the right-hand man of Moser and world champion. He had been to Australia for the Bank Classic, loved Australians, and he employed me as a mechanic at Olympia Dortmund, which was the world's biggest amateur team. I had no effing idea, had a glue attire on.
Wow.
Like my background as a uni was interior design. So for me, it was like I was sitting at night thinking, what the hell am I doing? So, but, we did races like DuPont Tour. I'm not sure if you remember those.
Yeah.
And I remember flying over there thinking, what in the hell am I doing? Like I was like the con artist from hell. So,
yeah.
But I learned my trade. And the thing with Germans, they tell you once, they don't tell you twice. That's it.
Wow.
So there's no question. But and that was the quite funny thing for us. That was a close friend of mine who just passed away from Heiko Salzwedel. We were like the second home for the Aussie riders because they were that poor back then. They didn't have a base. So I used to look after Robbie McEwen, all those type of guys, Hank Vogels, and those type of guys that would come to us and stay with us because they had nowhere else to stay. Like Heiko had a shoestring budget. And I remember their material, it was just woeful. Like it was hanging on. I think they had giant bikes at one point,
the Cadex.
Rogers, the 2 Rogers boys. And it was quite amazing, seeing the poor side of those famous bike riders back then. Like it was just like they had no idea where the direction was going to be or what was going on, huh?
Wow. So what about you, mate? What about when you were training for the Herald Sun Tour? What sort of Ks were you doing? Were you like
1,000 K a week, block Ks? I trained with Robert Burns. You got your Rick McKay. Back then, it was just all block 200K a day. So the Sun Tour back then, it was 1,400K, 10-day tours. So back then, it was serious stuff. So we used to, Spirit of Tasmania used to be a big sponsorship. I think one of my first Sun Tours, we did 3 or 4 days in Tasmania.
Wow.
And I do remember when we climbed over Heartbreak Hill, no one knew about it. We had 42.21s. So back then, you know, there wasn't Strava. There wasn't all this technology. It was all just raw bullshit, you know, like.
So how did you get up the hill?
Well, I was in a breakaway with Barry Burns. Remember Barry?
Yeah.
And also Pat McCucci, the other party king of Marcel. And we were lucky to be in a break. And I was called by 4 riders. One was being Neil Stevens and someone else. And that was all that caught us. Because it was back then, you didn't get on Strava, you didn't get on profiles to know what you were doing. So it was all unheralded. So these Europeans would come over thinking, oh, yeah, this is a piece of cake, not realising that the Australian terrain is different from Europe. Yeah. So it was always quite, you know, funny. And with John Craven, he was a journalist, you know, with the Herald Sun. I think he liked sensationalism. He liked races that had dramatic stages. If it was climbs in Tassie, back then, I mean, gravel racing, you know, just talking before with Peter Mullins, you know, gravel racing is the big thing. Back then, we had gravel racing at every second stage of the Sun Tour. If it wasn't pick a plank on a bridge, it was a gravel stage, wasn't it, huh?
Wow.
Darren, we really like to ask our guests as well and probably go back a little bit about what it was about riding and racing that really grabbed you, mate. What was the main thing that attracted you to it?
Well, in Benny as a tradition, because the Benny and Madison, like a lot of towns in Australia, don't have cycling that's up there on the ante. The Benny and Madison had 10 to 12,000 people coming to a bike race. It's unheard of in Australia. So the Benny and Madison's got a lot to do with the history of cycling in Australia. So for us, you're brought up in an institution. It is great to ride a bike. And also, you know, like my brother loved bikes. So that's the big key. That's why Bendigo produces the Jack Haigs, the Chris Hamiltons, and the people, even the Peter Mullins and all these famous athletes, is because it's a town that embraces cycling. So that's the difference between a lot of townships is track is the core, it's the grassroots. And that's why we have, you know, J Cycle starting up soon with the track, you know, with Noel Sands and a lot of our Bendigo communities, because that's really important feature. And that's what I learned. Like I rode only a couple of Bendigo Madisons, but I was privileged to ride those Madisons, you know, and my brother-in-law, you know, Scott McGrory winning the Madison, like I know he's Olympic champion and whatever, but for him to win the Bendigo Madison, you know, it was an incredible feat. He, you know, I think when he came back from the Olympics, it was a very dramatic Madison with a big crash. But for him to win the Bendigo Madison was, you know, it was a really big feather in his cap, you know, besides his 6-day success. So track racing, I think a lot of people in Australia forget how important track racing is to the Australian culture, huh? Yeah. I mean, I rode Tassie Carnivals. I rode 2. I think I was second in Launceston to one of the Rice brothers. And like, to me, that was just, it was like being a pro, like going to Tassie and living it tough and trying to fight for your dollar. Like that's where, you know, you got to realise that track racing has a real important part for Australian culture. You know, look at Stuart O'Grady, Brad McGee, even Cookie. I remember meeting Cookie as a kid. You know, he was best mates with one of my mates in Bendigo, Timmy Bennett. And they all come from track racing, huh?
Yeah, great background.
Yeah, Victoria used to do the amazing Christmas. Sorry, mate. The amazing Christmas carnivals. I used to do those. The Victorian Christmas carnivals. You do Shep, Horsham, Ararat, Bendigo, Ballarat. Those Chrissy carnivals were just phenomenal back in the day.
Yeah, I'll just get my charger going here. But yeah, you know, like that's what it just, that's the importance of, you know, track racing is, you know, like it does create, you know, leg speed, you know, and it's a simple technology. So for a lot of poor kids, they can afford a track race before they can afford a road race, huh? Yeah, you know, back in my era, like my brother, his first bike was from the tip. He had to, you know, paint himself and whatever. So for a lot of Australian families, cycling is an expensive sport. So, you know, that's where, you know, it was, you know, important, you know, like, and I remember, you know, Danny Clark and those, you know, Don Allen and those kids. Like, I've got as much fond memories as the famous track riders more than the road riders, huh?
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul, I cut you off, mate. What were we going to say?
Well, I was just going to ask, in summary, Darren, how long did you ride, or riding career go for before you transitioned?
Still going.
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff.
Look, I when I come back, I started racing again. I was doing mountain biking. You know, like I'm a part of the Benia Club. I do all their events, which is one of the first clubs in Australia to have a gravel event. You know, I still can ride off second scratch or whatever, but you know, it's you once you got that drug in your system, you just can't get it out. So
was there ever a time when you were riding in the Herald Sun Tour and you're doing all that training? Was there ever a time you thought, I'm going to take this overseas? Marcel might, see if he can get me in a European team. Was there ever a time you thought, I'm going to make that transition?
Look, I don't think I never thought I was good enough. I was always, look, it was difficult. Like I rode enough Sun Tours and third in Melbourne, Yarrawonga off scratch, but I was never a winner. I think it was just the experience for a lot of young Australians back then. That was connection back then. Like to go to Europe and try to get a contract was a really difficult, look, I even think about, we talked about before, Alan Piper, who I've worked with at HCC Columbia. Even for him, I was talking to him to go to Europe and, the Australian Aussie kids, it was back then, it was a big step. And if you went over there, you're balls deep. It was everything or nothing. So I think not to say the Australian, look, we've just had a Bendigo rider come back tonight, Sam Eddy, with Bridge Lane. And he's a champion bike rider and he's a real goer, but, it was a tough gig in COVID. Like he's gone back to the grassroots, really having a go. But I don't think Australian young cyclists realise how hard it was even for Alan Piper, when he rode for Tulip and those teams, how tough it was. Even Neil Stevens, when I rode with Neil in Sun Tours, he was not a given contract. And even people know with Simon Gerrans, like I worked with Phil Anderson with training groups. And then we had
we've just lost him there, mate. We might call a pause to this because I think we've got a two-parter here. Paul, we might wrap this one up, mate, for our viewers tonight, and we'll start the second part of the conversation in a moment. But, Paul, you don't do a closeout and we'll say thanks to all of our viewers?
Absolutely, mate. And look, great to hear from Darren. It's a great story. I'm probably going to take up a little bit of airtime now with some what I call administrative stuff, but got a few shout-outs. I wanted to say thanks so much. We've now got 487 members on the Facebook. Bit of a favour, though, to everyone, if you can actually go on the YouTube and like the actual and view the videos, it would bump up our profile a little bit. So thank you for that. A huge plug for the sponsors, for Tailwind. Thank you for the gift this week. Absolutely awesome. I love you guys. Shout out to Joel at Leica Brothers. And we've got another new sponsor on this week, which is the good old Pete Hodgson from Just Dig Deeper Training, from Try Training. So a huge shout out to Hodgie. He's a great guy, and I strongly recommend his coaching methods. He's very down to earth. So shout out to Hodgie. Got a couple of local events coming up as well this weekend. A couple of club races, both at Singleton and Tomaree. So if you can get out to those, both on Sunday, both online. A shout out to Paul Humphreys from H Events, organising the Maitland Triathlon on the 12th of December. Get on board with that. We've all been in lockdown. We all want to race, so it'll be good to get out to that. The Sri Chinmoy Triple Triathlon off-road. Yours truly on the 14th of November. Don't do that race. It's not good. We've also got a future guest coming on in a couple of weeks, John Demandel, who's a visually impaired athlete, but he's about to embark on a huge challenge, 7 half Ironmans in 7 days. So a huge shout out to John. He's going to be live on Try Buzz with Muzz, Pete Murray, tomorrow night. So look forward to that as well. I'm getting there, mate. Shout out to Vlad Shatrov, who starts his epic 270-kilometre run from Sydney to Newcastle this Friday, starting at 5 a.m. and hoping to land in Newcastle in under 35 hours. And the last one is the social gathering on the 4th of December. I'll put up a couple of posts about that on the Facebook group. It's at Bar Beach Bowling Club. It wouldn't be anywhere else. My favourite place in the world.
That's our entire budget, our entire marketing budget for the year.
Blown. So
4th of December.
I'll shut up now. Thanks,
4th
mate.
of December. Thanks,
Good,
and we'll bring you part 2 of our interview with Turtle himself shortly.
Good
Thanks,
stuff,
everyone.
buddy. Have a good one.